good evening and welcome. There we go. Yes, yes. Thank you so much for coming. All right, well, welcome. My name is Donika Thurston, and I am the Executive Director of the Lynn Museum and Lynn Arts. Welcome again. And, thank you. And I have the esteemed pleasure of being your moderator this evening. On behalf of Lynn Museum Lynn Arts, Grand Army of the Republic Lynn, the City of Lynn, and the Defending Democracy Planning Team, which includes my co-conspirators Wendy Joseph and Steve Matthews, thank you for joining us this evening for this dynamic and important program. Yes. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. As Wendy mentioned, we do have translation services available this evening in Spanish and Haitian Creole, and folks are welcome to grab these devices as needed. A reminder to our speakers this evening to speak slowly and clearly so that everyone can fully participate in tonight's experience. Also, a kind reminder to silence your cell phones during the duration of the program. So why are we here this evening? On the heels of 3 monumental events in United States history, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Gettysburg Address, we are here to learn and reflect on this history, to collectively dig a little deeper into this history, and ultimately to illuminate and discuss what issues our community is facing today and how can we collectively solve them. We have 2 incredible panels here for you this evening, as well as a live reenactment. We do have information on all of our panelists and our reenactors in the program book. Hopefully all of you have one, and if you do not, they are available in the lobby. There will be 2 Q&A sessions as part of tonight's program. Folks are welcomed and encouraged to submit questions to be considered for our panels. We should have provided index cards and pencils for folks to use to submit questions, and you can turn those into Steve and Tom. Wave around. Hey, there we are. You can turn those questions into them. Let's see. There are some folks that we need to thank. It would be helpful if I turned it on. There we go. Our sponsor, The Daily Item and Essex Media Group. Our supporters, Essex County Community Organization, New Lynn Coalition, Lynn Teachers Union, the Freedom to Read Foundation, and Tom Dalton. Round of applause. I also want to give a very big round of applause to all of the folks that you see here and in the program book tonight who financially contributed to tonight's program and made tonight possible. So big round of applause for all of those folks. Thank you. And with that, I would like to welcome Mayor Nicholson to kick off our event and share some opening remarks. Mayor Nicholson?
Good evening, everyone. I like to do that first so I can test a little bit how the AV is doing. Obviously, it's very on point tonight, so I'll take a step back. Thank you all so much for being here. First, I want to thank the GAR, Wendy Joseph, the Lynn Museum, Donika Thurston, and Steve Matthews for all their efforts in putting together tonight's wonderful event and program. Thank you so much. Thanks also to the sponsors and supporters. It's obviously a team effort to get something like this together. All the folks at City Hall working on putting this together, and our distinguished panelists, who I think is going to be a terrific discussion that we're lucky to have here in City Hall. And most of all, to all of you, I saw a lot of familiar faces here, a lot of groups that are represented, bringing your teams here for some really important reflection. So thank you all for being here. I am particularly excited for tonight's discussion. You know, I think about the GAR, and my grandfather's grandfather is up in that room in the Great Hall there, his portrait. And I revered my grandfather growing up. I spent a lot of time with him, and he revered his grandfather. So I heard a lot of those stories, and he was so proud of his service for the Union, preserving the Union, fighting for freedom in the Civil War. And my grandfather was a Purple Heart veteran in World War II, and that history, going up into his attic and sorting through his medals and his papers with my grandfather, was a big part of what instilled the value of service in me. And so I feel the immediacy and the impact of that history every day. And I think that's partly why I have such a hard time with this idea that is popping up around the country, denying the importance, the immediacy, the relevancy of history, particularly when you talk about the enslavement of Black people and how that has affected a whole category of people in this country. And, you know, part of that, I think, I'm sure has to do with the contrast between the nation we thought we were, the nation we hoped we could be, and the nation that we were, and the nation that we in many ways still are in terms of the work that we still have to do. And that conflict and those ideals is hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around. But the only way to close that gap between who we want to be and who we are is to look at the truth with clear eyes, confront it, and that, I think, is a big part of the goal for tonight. It's a goal of a lot of the organizations that are working here in the city. It's certainly a goal of the city from my perspective and from this administration. We're going to hear later from one of our panelists who's one of the leaders in that work on behalf of the city, Faustina Cuevas, who's our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Officer and a senior advisor in my office, and we'll look forward to hearing from that, as well as the others whose mission it is to continue to drive this work forward, to tackle racial justice in a meaningful way. And understanding how we got here is such an important part of that. And so really glad to be on that journey with all of you this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor Nicholson. My third great-grandfather, Alfred DeLand, also has his portrait in the GAR, so I'd like to think maybe they shared a drink or two in the hall. So we are going to kick things off with our second panel. As I mentioned, we have information on all of our panelists and our reenactors in the program book. I know it's going to be a pretty heavy program tonight, so we're going to save the bios. I encourage you to, again, check out the program book. And with that, we are going to bring up Dr. Kabria Baumartner of Northeastern University and Billy Keyserling, former mayor of Beaufort, South Carolina, to kick us off and explore this very important history. So with that, Kabria and Billy.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you all at this symposium. I also want to share my thanks to the organizing committee for bringing us all together this evening to reflect on the 160th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's also an honor to share space with Mayor Billy. That's what we affectionately call him. He and I have had numerous conversations about what defending democracy means now and what it meant 100 years ago, 200 years ago, even in 1863. And so as I was thinking about 1863 and more broadly United States history, I couldn't help but remember that as a child, I didn't enjoy studying history at all. And I think it was in part because I was taught to memorize facts and dates and figures. So I'm part of that generation of young people who studied for the AP US History exam. And that was the extent of how I was understanding and relating to history. I was asked to consume facts and then to spit them back out. And I wanted something more robust, something more visceral. And what's interesting is that now, 15 years later, I'm a professor of 19th century US history. So. And so I want to talk a little bit about what changed for me and how that transformation happened. And this also relates to some of the conversations that Mayor Billy and I had leading up to this event. One of the things that Mayor Billy said that really struck me was that the Civil War is often about the battles and generals. But the era of Reconstruction, that period from 1861 to roughly 1900, that period is about the people. It's about rebuilding a nation. And so what brought me back to history was the people. It was learning the stories of ordinary people who led protests that sparked social movements. It was the people, to quote Abraham Lincoln, who called and claimed a new birth of freedom. I'm thinking about those self-emancipated people who fled the South, right, and risked their lives for freedom. I'm thinking about Black women who armed themselves to protect their children, right? And so one of the historic figures that I wanted to talk to you about tonight, whose legacy and activism should inspire all of us, is Robert Morris. And he's pictured here on my left. Robert Morris was one of the first African-American lawyers in the United States, and he practiced right here in Massachusetts. He argued labor, education, and racial discrimination cases in Boston courtrooms. He personally rescued enslaved people, and he even sought public office, so he ran unsuccessfully for mayor of Chelsea. And I find in studying his life that he was able to accomplish all that he did because he was inspired by his family, because he benefited from the strength of Black communities and communities of color that nurtured him, and also because he was committed to the pursuit of equality and justice. So I'll tell you a little bit more about him. He was born on June 28th, 1824, and he was raised in an abolitionist household not too far from here in Salem. His parents were York and Mercy Morris, and they were influential members of Salem's Free Black community. They were involved in mutual aid organizations and religious societies. And as a Black boy growing up in Salem, Robert Morris said, "I had never been brought up with the idea of inferiority to any person." And he learned that from his parents. And it was foundational at a time when racism touched every part of American life, from housing to schools, from jobs to the church. But Robert Morris walked around knowing and believing that he was inferior to no one. And that anchored him and gave him the confidence to dream otherwise and to dream big. So in 1838, at the age of 14 years old, Morris moved to Boston to work as a servant in the household of a white abolitionist couple. And almost immediately upon moving to Boston, his social calendar filled up with all kinds of activities. He was attending anti-slavery meetings, he was attending literary lectures, and even took part in performances, elocutionary exercises, as they were called in the early 19th century. And I think from these activities, we can see that he was able to claim place. He was able to feel like he belonged because he was connected to this community. He found community with other Black youth, right, with other young Black people. And together they formed an education society in Boston. And that's where reading and writing and debating was serious business. In this education organization, Black youth reflected upon their own learning. And one of the things that struck them was that they were being schooled in racially segregated schools. And they wanted to change that. So in Boston, the schools were racially segregated. In Salem at that time, the schools were racially segregated too. So Morris and his comrades pursued one of the most democratic options they had available to them, and that was petitioning. They petitioned the school committee in Salem and in Boston to abolish racially segregated schools. They said those schools were unjust, they were anti-Republican, anti-democratic, and unfair. And so they demanded a quality education for all children on an equal and inclusive basis, regardless of race. And what's remarkable is that the petition was persuasive. It was convincing. And at least in Salem, the school committee there decided to integrate their public schools. And that happened in 1844. So Salem is known as one of the first municipalities to integrate its public schools. That was a big victory for Robert Morris, right? It was a big victory for him in his hometown. But there was no such luck in Boston. The Boston school committee actually rejected the petition, and the schools in that city remained segregated for a while. It was at this point that Robert Morris began to think about another path for achieving Black educational rights, and that path was the law. He believed that the law could influence democratic institutions like schools. So he began to study law with a white lawyer. This was sort of before the time where we had lots of law schools. So it was common to study law with a lawyer and then sit for the bar. And so in 1847, Robert Morris passed the Massachusetts bar, which was a huge achievement and again made him one of the first Black lawyers in the United States. And one of the first cases that he took on was a school integration case, the case of Sarah Roberts. Sarah Roberts was a 5-year-old girl who was growing up in Boston, and she was expelled from an all-white school in Boston because she was Black. And so her father recruited or hired Robert Morris to defend Sarah Roberts' educational rights. That case made its way to the Massachusetts Judicial Supreme Court, and there, under Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw, the court ruled that the Boston School Committee could organize its schools however it wanted. So that means that racial segregation was upheld. If we think about Robert Morris, one of the character traits that comes to mind is perseverance. So even though this was a legal defeat, he persevered anyway. He rallied the community, organizing meetings, protesting, and even boycotting Boston's public school system, because he was committed to dismantling racist structures, and he believed in equality before the law. But I don't mean to romanticize the law and what the law can do, and I think Morris didn't romanticize it either. He knew and understood that he would have to confront the failure of law. In a nation that was half slave, half free, a nation where laws upheld slavery, he knew that his efforts had to extend beyond the courtroom, especially after the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. So he made it his life's work to lay bare the contradictions at the heart of the American nation. And he did so through protesting, through writing, organizing, and what I might call bending the law. And one of his friends described him and his work as a living protest. And I think that means that Robert Morris was a living protest to racism and to racial discrimination. He embodied particular ideals. So Morris, in his lifetime, saw the passage of legislation integrating public schools in the state of Massachusetts, and that happened in 1855. And he lived to see the abolition of slavery in the United States in 1865. And he supported Reconstruction-era amendments because he said that these laws were needed to codify Black civil rights, especially at a critical moment in the nation's post-war rebuilding. On December 12, 1882, Robert Morris passed away at the age of 58. Upon his death, he was described as one of the most respected colored men of his age, even being compared to Frederick Douglass. What's interesting is we probably all know the name of Frederick Douglass, but we don't all know the name of Robert Morris. He was a defender of democracy right here in Massachusetts, having spent 14 years in Salem, having visited Lynn many times, and having lived the rest of his life in Chelsea and in Boston. And so his legacy is really about encouraging future generations to carry on the tradition of protest, to carry forward the progress that had been made. So I think Morris would say that every generation has a role to play in defending democracy. History is important, and it's important for so many reasons. But one reason is to learn the rights and responsibilities that we each have and hold in a democracy. Is to learn this history, to hear and listen to our ancestors like Robert Morris, to see and learn what they did so we know what we have to do. Thank you. I will now pass it over to Mayor Billy.
So how'd my little sister do? You know, in a few Zoom calls, we've had a great time, and we're so different. She's a historian. I'm not. You have to hold her accountable, not me. But it's funny because in full disclosure, I'm really not a historian. And it was in the 9th grade that I got my first D in a class because it was world history and the book was that thick. and I couldn't read it. And so my parents, I got caught. My parents fortunately could send me and give me what turned out to be the biggest gift of my life, is they sent me up here to a very small boarding school with small classes and lots of personal attention. And I learned how to learn, even though it would not be through reading, because I'm dyslexic, even though they didn't know what dyslexia was at the time. I'm also attention deficit, and as of the last year, I'm legally blind. But I just didn't like history, but I didn't like it because it was so much stuff. It was dates, it was wars, it was stories, it was treaties, and I never realized that, and until recently, I broke down the word history, and there's only one problem with history, because it's his story. What about her story? That didn't even come with the 15th Amendment. We had to wait for that, with the right to vote for women. But when I was 17, I wrote a paper in that school, and I got an F for history, because I wrote a book with a narrative that the white tenant farmers were also imprisoned, were also in their own way enslaved, were also controlled. They weren't physically held up, and they weren't necessarily beaten, but they were emotionally beaten, they were financially beaten by the landowners as much, if not more, well, as much as the enslaved Africans. And so the story was bigger, and so I wrote a scenario that the two of them set aside the color of their skin and looked at what they had in common, and realized had they realized what a political and economic force they had, this country would be so different today, and probably on a better course than we are now. I get very wrapped up about this, and we are a runaway train, so when its time's up, someone's gonna have to carry me off the stage, because I've been working on this for 10 years. And when I first talked to Steve, thank you, Steve, for bringing me here. Thank you, Wendy, and your team for everything you've done. Thank you, sis, for becoming our friend. But we talked about the anatomy of building a national park. And that's my head, not my heart. And right now I prefer to talk about my heart. But I think it's important, because one of the reasons I came here, other than that I was invited, was that I think there are ways that you could be part of what we are building. The story started in 2000 with then Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, former governor of Arizona, was about to leave office. And I didn't know this until recently, but he was a civil rights lawyer before he became governor. And he said he looked around him as Secretary of Interior and said, we have all these parks that tell the American story. We got battlefields, we got natural resources, we've got old houses, presidents' houses. But what's this thing called Reconstruction? So he went to the historian at the National Park Service and said, tell me about Reconstruction. I think something's missing from our history. And he was sent to meet with Eric Foner, and Foner said, meet me in Beaufort, South Carolina. And after a few days with local historians and with community leaders, they met with Senator Hollings, who was our senator at the time, and Congressman Wilson, who was our congressman at the time, and they drafted legislation to create a national recognition of Reconstruction. Hollings passed it in the Senate. The Sons of the Confederacy threatened Wilson, and he withdrew his, and it died. Fast forward to 2016, I'm sitting in my office, I'm then mayor, and it's Congressman Clyburn, who I've known since the 70s. And he said, I'm in my office with Bruce Babbitt, and we got an idea. We got a new way to approach this Reconstruction memory, but it can't be done through a law, and it can't cost any money. And I said, well, that sounds great. What's my role? And he said, it has to be driven by the grassroots. Would you be willing to bring in some of the partners and build a partnership to put together a grassroots campaign? And this was in March of 2016. President Obama only had X number of months. And the Park Service said, you'll never get it done. And I said, well, wait and see. So within about 2 months, I had 167 historians writing to the Secretary of the Interior and to the President. We had a public hearing in Brick Church, which is one of the sites of the monument. And the Park Service said, well, we'll never get it done this year in this administration, but we'll come to Beaufort. You've obviously worked hard on this. We agree with you. It should be done. So we filled Brick Baptist Church, and to a T, the packed church, all people said is, we want to know the truth. So John Jarvis, I think it is, called me outside after the hearing, and he said, I've been doing this all my life. I go to public hearings every week. People all over the country want parks, but they talk about economic development, they talk about jobs, they talk about tourism. He said, you had 60 or so people talk, and there were more in line to talk, and every single one of them said, all we want is the truth. He said, he pulled me aside and said, let's try it. It's slim chances, but let's try it. And so using what's called the Antiquities Act, which was created by President Theodore Roosevelt, the president can proclaim a national monument, but he cannot spend government money, and it must be done on government property. Well, that posed a problem because 3 of the 4 sites that we picked were on private property. One, Camp Saxton, which is where the first colored troops were trained, the Carolina First Volunteers, and others later, and where the Emancipation was read, we believe, the first time in the South on January 1st, 1863. That was on the Navy Hospital base, so that wasn't a problem. But then we needed a welcome center, and my brother and I had restored an old building in the center of the city, and we donated it. Then Penn Center donated the oldest building on their campus, and then Brick Church donated a facade easement on the church, and so we were off and running. But when you give to the government, you got to do your environmental, you got to do your survey, you got to do your title work, you got to do everything. And in an amazing amount of time, by December of 2016, we had a package ready to go. And I remember getting a call from the Deputy Chief of Staff for Secretary Jewell, Sally Jewell of Interior, and she said, Billy, please stop these letters. And I said, well, you wanted to see public support. And she said, well, if I take all this time to read all these damn letters, we're never going to write this proclamation. And so 6 days, I think it was, I get my dates confused, President Obama declared the Reconstruction Era National Monument. Now, a monument was not what we think of as a monument, a granite stone. In this case, it's 4 sites, all within about 5 or 6 miles of each other, but you have to drive them. But Clyburn and I then said, well, we got this far. Let's see what we can do to start growing it. You've got the community, you've got the historic preservation group, you got everybody going. Let's see if we can grow it. 2 years later, it passed on a voice vote and became the Reconstruction Era National Historical Park. And what's important to you and other communities around the country is we created a network, the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network, which are sites that would be part of a network that will be on a map that will cover the whole country, so that if one wants to take a tour, or one wants to put it on a map and teach geography around it, one can do it. And now we have 20 rangers, been in business only 5 years. We have 20 rangers. Our group, which is a nonprofit that has been raising money, or adding 3 new properties. One is a former freedman's cottage, which is a unique cottage that the freedmen built once they were freed. One is a deacon study house at one of the churches, and the other is the Grand Army Hall, which needed a whole new floor section, one of the most beautiful buildings, in my view, in Beaufort. And we're working on more, but we're also on the road looking for stories that fit and could be part of this network, with the idea of network sites getting together somehow, physically or virtually, once a year to talk about how they're growing their sites, to talk about their needs, to share about ideas about funding sources and creative ways of marketing them as part of this whole. So it's been a lot of work, a lot of money. We're in the middle right now. My brother and I didn't put it on the nonprofit, but we believed very strongly that Robert Small's home, where he was born enslaved and where he came back after capturing the planter, should be open to the public. And the Historic Beaufort Foundation said it's in the wrong neighborhood to be open to the public, and you'll wear it out, and blah, 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 blah. So we're in court over an easement, but I think in January we should actually end up in the courtroom, and I have no reason to believe that we won't get it, and I have no reason to believe that the National Trust for Historic Preservation will be the bridge. They will buy it. They've already raised the money to reimburse us, and then they will, with us, will give it to the national park. So it's been quite a ride. Now, that is the technical part. The emotional part, I think we better wait, and I'll stay over and you find me the right church. Give me 2 hours and I'll tell you why this is so important. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. It's been a delight to work with you, and we're just so eager to have you here this evening, and just thank you so much for being part of our first panel. And with that, we're going to open up to our Q&A. Mayor Billy, you are the author of the book, Finding Common Ground. Please share with us some ways you feel we can lessen political polarization in our country.
Say that one more time.
I will have to say that Steve or Tom came up with that question. You are the author of the book, Finding Common Ground.
Right.
Please share with us some ways you feel we can lessen political polarization in our country.
Well, you know, after working in the Senate, in the U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, being in the state legislature, city council, and mayor, I had 20 years, really had 40 years in and around government. And I saw it, I see it deteriorating every day. I see the anger, the hate, the inability to have a civil conversation. And as I learned about Reconstruction, I realized that Reconstruction is actually a pretty compact piece of history with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that I call, for lack of a better word, the historian will correct me, I'm sure, but the perfecting amendments. They almost took us to the promises that are unfulfilled, yet not forgotten. And so I basically said, I'm not going to be mayor. I'm going to go to work on how we can return civility, and how the answer is we don't feel common ground. We're a nation divided. We've been a nation divided. We were founded on division, and I don't mean to sound unpatriotic or cynical, but that is the history of this country. If you go back to the English, and just in your region, you go back to the English who didn't want the Irish, who didn't want the Italians, who didn't want the Hispanics, who didn't want the blacks, and there's a caste system. And there are the few who have done very well on the sweat of the many. Today, last poll I showed, the people most fearful of going to sleep at night are Asians. Why? Because they're successful. And some people don't want them to be successful. You know, my vision was that we would have this, we were going to create this fabulous salad bowl. And we were going to bring the condiments and all the different flavors and natural foods from all of our different backgrounds and cultures. And we're going to put them in a salad bowl, and we're going to mix it, and we're going to have it. And as everybody brought it, it was going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and everybody was going to get to share this salad. But what happened is we welcomed the immigrants when they were doing the dirty work. I mean, where I live right now, we have Hispanics. They're the only people who will be on a roof when it's 100 degrees, putting a roof on a new house in a growth area. But we can go through this. But what happened is we've made a marvelous salad, but it's still in the small bowl and still on the plates of the few, and the rest of us don't get the benefit of it. And so we need to figure out what the division was about, and Jim Crow, an example, because I think what Kabria is onto, and what Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass are onto, is history is about people as well as the places. And this is a young woman who I don't think she was ever enslaved, but as a child, she helped Harriet Tubman make bandages for wounded, escaped, enslaved Africans. And after Reconstruction, she went to medical school and was a great student, started to practice, but was told by Frederick Douglass to go to the Dominican Republican Commission because it was going to, Jim Crow was not going to give her the opportunity to shine the way she could shine. And there are tens of thousands of these people. I'll close with one thing that talks about the people, because I know I like to talk. But Henry Louis Gates, when he interviewed the comedian Chris Rock, said, "Chris, do you know anything about your ancestors?" And Rock said to him, "No, I really don't." And Gates said, "What would you do if I said that your great-great-grandfather was enslaved in Georgetown County, and then he went into the Union Army, and he became a corporal and a star?" And Gates and Rock sort of teared up. And he said, if I'd only known. He said, "What would you do if I said he then became a member of the state legislature? One of 2,000 African Americans who, during that short period of Reconstruction, they called the lost cause." And Rock really teared up at that point. And he said, "You know, if I'd only known, I've always credited my success to luck. And now I know the debt of gratitude that I owe to my blood, to my family, to my forebears. And there are so many kids on street corners today, black and white, who feel hopeless. And Reconstruction really was a chance to show that there was opportunity. There was opportunity.
Sorry to
and
interrupt.
That opportunity, of course, was clobbered.
Well, that's a nice segue into a question from the audience, or more of a celebratory. Sorry about that, folks. More of a celebratory comment to Dr. Baumgartner. Please tell us you're writing a book on Robert Morris! Need a full life in times.
Absolutely.
And then I do have two follow-up questions that I think are somewhat related. Where would we have Reconstruction monuments in Massachusetts? And then another question is, how do you feel about protesters tearing down statues, trying to erase our history? We can't learn from history, or can't we learn from history, good or bad?
I'll take the last question. I think there's a lot to discuss when we think about Confederate monuments. And so I have been on the side of protesters removing Confederate monuments, especially if we think about the context in which those monuments were erected in the first place. They were meant to try to shift and change the culture of the South, the lost cause scenario. So it makes sense to me that protesters now would like to see something different in the public landscape. Here in the North, in Massachusetts, I do think it's important for communities to be involved when it comes to moving a statue or changing a monument. It's a community decision. I live in Essex County. We're building creating a couple of markers in the downtown area of Newburyport, really remembering the history of African Americans in Newburyport, which is a very rich and exciting history. And we went to the city council and we said, is this something that the community wants? Is this something we can do? Is this something the city will fund? And we got buy-in, right? We got buy-in from the community, we got buy-in from the city. So I think when it comes to taking down statues and monuments, it's really up to the community.
All right, well, thank you both very much. Another round of applause for Dr. Kabria and Mayor Billy. And with that, we have our live reenactment featuring Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln.
It's us.
I was once asked to make a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of a national soldiers' cemetery in the battlefield town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Many brave soldiers had died there just 5 months earlier. It was a quiet place now, with rows and rows of graves. And I wanted to remind people of the larger meaning of this war. My speech wasn't long, not even 3 minutes, and at first I felt that perhaps some people were disappointed with it. But later, when they thought about what I said that day, they began to appreciate its significance. I'd like to read for you now that speech. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you. Well, it's Mr. Douglass, my old friend, Mr. Douglass. Mr. Douglass, very happy to see you here. I'm doing fine. How are you?
Wonderful, wonderful.
Very good. Very nice to see you.
Thank you.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm Frederick Douglass, and I was born a slave. My mother was sold, and I lived with her mother, Grandmother Betsy. I lived with Grandmother Betsy until I became old enough to work on the plantation. All I knew was that Grandmother Betsy loved me. I loved her. I didn't know I was a slave. One day, Grandmother came to me and said, "Go to bed early. We're going on a long journey tomorrow." That night, she came and knelt down beside my pallet. And she prayed a long prayer. And when she finished, she reached out her arms and gave me a big hug. The next morning before daylight, we set out walking. And we walked and walked, and when I would become tired, she would lift me up and tote me in her strong arms. I recall looking up and said, "Grandmama, tell me about my mama again." She said, "Boy, I done told you 1,000 times. Your mama said they took you out of her arms, but they could never take you out of her heart." We continued walking, and we walked and walked. Soon we came upon another cabin. It was bigger than our cabin, and there were little boys and girls all around, all colors and all sizes. She said, "Look, boy, those are your kinfolk. Go play with them." I was tired. I found an oak tree and lay down and went to sleep. Soon my brother Perry came over and shook me away. Said, boy, wake up, Grandmammy gone." And I jumped up and looked this way and looked that way. I began to call her name louder and louder. And when she didn't answer, I began to cry. And I cried myself to sleep. That was the last day I saw my grandmother. And that was the last day of my childhood. From that day forward, I began to learn what it meant to be a slave. I worked on the plantation for a while, but one day the master came to me and said, "Frederick, I'm going to send you to Baltimore to live with my brother and his family. Out of all the children on the plantation, he chose me. And he sent me." And living in Baltimore was better than living on that plantation. All I had to do is take care of a little boy named Tommy. And Tommy's mother was a kind white lady. She read to us every day, mostly from the Bible. She would sit down and I would get on the floor beside her and Tommy would be in her lap. And one day she looked down and said, "Frederick, honey, how would you like to learn to read?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she began to teach me my ABCs. And I was a fast learner. She taught me every day, and until that day the master came into the room and saw what she was doing, and he was mad. "Woman, you can't teach that Negro to read. He'll teach others to read, and you will run them all. They will no longer be fit to be slaves." I look up at old master. He didn't know he had just given me the most valuable lesson in my life. I now knew that if I would teach myself to read and write, educate myself, that would be my way out of slavery. Well, I endured slavery for almost 20 years. And then I ran away. The next few years, I met people, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, John Brown. I met white ladies, Susan B. Anthony, Amy Post, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, all fighting for something. But not a lot of progress was made until he came. You see, he was born a dirt poor farm boy in Kentucky. He was a man of unblemished character. He said slavery was wrong and there was a moral issue. He ran for the presidency of the United States and he won. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He won the presidency. But when he won, you see, there were loud cries of secession and rebellion from the southern states. And I wondered, would he compromise? Will Abraham Lincoln compromise? But when that first cannonball shattered the walls of Fort Sumter, I said, then and there, this war will not be fought entirely by white men. And eventually, I proved to be correct. You see, Abraham Lincoln had been promising to sign the Emancipation Proclamation with my prodding. And eventually, on January the 1st, 1863, I was in Boston, not far from here. There were two mass assemblies, one in Tremont Temple and the other in Music Hall. I believe I was in Music Hall. No, I was in Tremont Temple in Union Hall. I mean, you should have seen the people there. They were dancing and singing, and my good friends were speaking, and the Philharmonic was playing. We kept sending messengers to the telegraph, but they kept coming back empty. Time went by, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And it wasn't until Judge Thomas Ross went to the telegraph and came back waving that document in his hand. He read it. All people held slaves and said states, henceforth, now and forever, shall be free. I've never seen such joy in my life. They were laughing and dancing, hats and bonnets flew in the air. I didn't exactly like it, but one thing it did, it opened the Union forces to African Americans. Now, my black man could fight for his own freedom. They made me a recruiter for those men, and I bellowed. The trumpet has sounded. Men of color to arms, this is your golden opportunity. And they came. 200,000 of them came because they were tired of their women being abused. They were tired of being beaten and treated like beasts. They came. They enlisted and they fought gallantly. That led to a most interesting meeting at the White House. You see, there I was sitting. We all filled out cards and sent them forward, hoping to have audience with the president. Soon a man appeared at the top of the stairs and said, "The president wishes to see Frederick Douglass." You should have heard the names I was called when I said, "Out of my way. I'm Frederick Douglass, and the president wants to see me." I made my way to the stairs and climbed them, thinking about my mama, Harriet, and my grandmama, Betsy. And I gazed in the room, and there sat Abraham Lincoln, much as I thought it would be. One foot over in that part of the room and the other foot way over here in this part of the room. I approached him, and he began to rise and rise and rise. I reached out my hand to shake his hand, and he said,
"Mr. Douglass,
"Yes."
I know all about you, and I treasure your criticisms of me. Now, some people say you're a little harsh, but you're honest, and I very much appreciate that. I welcome your advice and your counsel, sir."
Yes, sir. May I have a seat?
Yes. Please sit down.
Thank you, sir. Can I have a drink of water, please?
Well, yes.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, you're quite welcome.
Well, Mr. Lincoln, you said you know me. If you know me, you know I'm a free man.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm not here for myself. I'm here for those I represent. You know, I was made a recruiter for those men, and I was told to tell them that if you join, you'll get equal pay, you'll get equal training, and you'll get equal promotions and commendations. Mr. Lincoln, none of that has happened. And today, many of my men are reluctant to join. And if you don't do something about that, Mr. Lincoln, you, sir, will be held equally responsible as Jeff Davis.
Well, I very much appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Mr. Douglass, and I will definitely look into it.
The meeting went on quite some time, but when it ended, we both rose to our feet. He reached out his hand and shook my hand. He made me feel like a man, and I left thinking but one thing: Abraham Lincoln was an honest man. The war went on some time, and eventually the North was victorious, and the South, with all of its generals, was defeated, never to rise again. Thousands of men died. 40,000 men of those 200,000 black men died. And my friend, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated. Had the curtain of death come down upon him, but slowly, had he lived to see the end of his great works, had he lived a long life, one in which his temperate habits gave promise, we still would have admired him greatly. But taken away the way he was, killed, assassinated, taken away by surprise, not because he was hated man, but because of what he did, not only for my people, but what he did as an example of freedom and liberty throughout the world. And his memory will be precious to us always.
All right. Thank you, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. I'm now going to invite our second group of panelists. I know we are running over, but I promise this last panel is very much worth the wait. So each panelist is going to share about 2 to 3 minutes about an issue that they want to bring to the community forefront, and then we will have another Q&A session. So again, submit any and all questions to Steve and Tom here at the front to be considered for the Q&A. But with that, yes, folks, come on out. Give our panelists a round of applause. And another kind reminder that all of their information and bios are in the program book, so please feel free to give it a read. But it is my esteemed pleasure to kick off our second panel with some opening remarks that from an individual that I'm sure many of you know. It's more of a welcome home, former superintendent of Lynn Public Schools and now Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Dr. Patrick Tutwiler.
Good evening. See, they didn't realize that I don't fit in small spaces, so I gotta move that over a little bit. Oh, wow, okay, wonderful. I've been backstage and not able to see everyone who's here. Thank you all so much for coming out. It is wonderful to be back in this space. I've had so many fond memories of events here, watching students play instruments here. It's just great to be back here this evening. And special shouts out to the organizers for coming up with this idea and then seeing it through, following through, and we are here. So last week, I think it's important to share that I had a brief planning call with Danica, who's doing a great job emceeing tonight. And she told me that I have wide latitude to go for as long as I want this evening. Okay? So let me assuage any worries that I'm actually going to, because many of you know that I have a fail-safe formula for remarks delivery. It's something I call my 3B formula, and for those who don't know, that is be good, be brief, and be seated. And so I promise you I will not go on long here. So what are we doing here this evening? We are here taking up the issue of defending democracy. Democracy. Such a novel concept, a profound concept. One that is built on two important foundational elements. Individual autonomy, right? The idea that folks can have control or should have control over their own lives. And then equality, right? The opportunity extended to everyone to have the same opportunity to influence decisions that affect people in this society. So I'm not going to turn this into a political science lesson, but I think we can all agree that democracy is a novel concept. And the idea this evening is to think about ways to protect it, because it is under attack. I see my role as an educator as being central to uplifting and protecting the ideas related to democracy through teaching, learning, developing in students the critical skills of analysis, critical thinking, communication. Related, this evening, I have a couple of ideas that I want to share with you. But before that, let me talk about beliefs. Because I believe that you can't separate a person or the ideas from beliefs. So I'm just going to share a little bit about me and a little bit about my background before I share the ideas. Quickly, I am not from Massachusetts. I was born in Chicago. My mother, who I love dearly, took us on a journey, Illinois to Texas to Minnesota, before I came out here for college. And all of that was related to her journey as an educator. She raised both me and my brother by herself. And over all of those moves, through all of those years, both of us watched very closely. With the deep knowledge of an educator, but the fierce love of a mother, my brother Timmy and I watched her fight for us to ensure that we received the best possible education, no matter what state we found ourselves. We watched her safeguard our potential, respectfully disagree about our placements, labels even, that might otherwise have attached themselves to not only our transcripts, but our internal view of ourselves as learners. We watched her type a dissertation on a typewriter. These experiences through all that inform who I am as an educator in so many ways, an educator who operates from a firm set of core values, the core of which is love for students. That matters. An educator who seeks to listen and understand the stories and experience of students and families, because I know that having that understanding, validating those experiences is key to a successful partnership. An educational leader who will respectfully and almost never apologetically disagree when a decision does not center a student's best interests at its core, because that matters. Thank you. And if you want this to be short, you can't be doing that, though, okay? An educator who feels strongly that the mark of a thriving and healthy school or school district is its ability to uplift and reach its most underserved student population. I said I wasn't going to go on long here, and I'm not. I'll leave it there. But I thought it was important to share with you a little bit about who's speaking to you, because that matters. These experiences are wrapped up in a statement that was shared with me by a fellow mentor many years ago. And some people have heard this. This is my mantra as a leader in education. As a leader in education, I must love the student, the teacher, and the craft of teaching, none more than the other, but in that order. Again, the key word in that statement is love. What does it mean to love our students? All of them. A very dear friend and colleague of mine and the executive director at KIPP frequently references the reverent words of James Baldwin, "All of the children are all of ours." But what does that actually mean? To love our students is to acknowledge and understand who they are, to validate their lived experience and journey, the journey of people who look like them, and to provide them with what they need to realize their dreams. From the standpoint of our work as educators, the work we do with students is more than Lord of the Flies or polynomials or the periodic table. I'm talking about leveling the playing field for historically marginalized groups. I'm talking about breaking cycles of poverty. I'm talking about working with students to help them establish control over their lives, partnering to create the condition for them to realize their dreams. That's what it means to love our students. And in loving all of our students in this way, we are stabilizing and even furthering this novel concept of democracy. Now, I'm pleased to acknowledge that many of the shifts that we're seeing that erode this novel concept, particularly in the education space in other states, is not the case here. That's not to say that there aren't challenges here, but in my capacity as Secretary of Education and with the support of this administration, we intend to further some of the steps that solidify who we are, what we believe, that all of the children are all of ours. Allow me to briefly illustrate through our journey, and I'll keep this short. I think many folks in this space are familiar with the significant Ed Reform Act that happened about 30 years ago that did a lot of progressive things in the education space. It created an assessment and accountability system, licensure standards, core content standards, and frameworks. All of these important shifts pushed Massachusetts to the top in terms of educational performance in the country. In fact, for years now, Massachusetts has been number 1 or number 2 for some. In the blistering report released in 2017, the theme of number 1 for some put Massachusetts on blast, as my children would say, for touting best in nation outcomes, but failing to lift up that those outcomes don't reflect the success for all students. There are many examples in that 2017 report, but I'll just offer 2. Less than 1 in 3 Black and Latino 4th graders are on grade level in reading, half that for the state's white students. And while the Commonwealth was number 1 in math in 2017, Black and brown students' performance landed them on par with state performance near the bottom, in fact, in line with performance for students in Mississippi. These data align with graduation rates, push-out rates, college matriculation, you name it, and I think you get the picture. Now, I suppose the powers that be could sort of sweep this under the rug, but I think we all know that with shifting demographics, not just here in the Commonwealth, but nationally, that strategy is not going to work, in addition to being unconscionable. 2 things have to happen. 1, we need to embrace the moral imperative of meeting the needs of all of our students and acknowledge that some students need something different or more, and that's what equity is. All of our children are all of ours. And second, policy, funding, and accountability have to be the teeth in this effort. And in our beloved Commonwealth, this has come in the form of a few important moves so far. In 2017, the Language Opportunities for Our Kids Act, which gave school districts more flexibility to align instructional strategy with research and validated the importance of multilingualism with the seal of biliteracy, made a shift in this state. In 2018, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education shifted its accountability measures, placing deeper importance on meeting the needs of historically underserved populations, adding more weight to multilingual learners' progress toward English proficiency, closing gaps toward the lowest performing students, and access to advanced coursework. And in 2019, this is a big one, thank you Sheila and Beth, the Student Opportunity Act came into view, which provides increased per pupil funding for students with disabilities, multilingual learners, and students who are economically disadvantaged. This positively impacts every district, or any district that has students in those subgroups, but particularly urban centers. And as a matter of fact, right here in Lynn, the Student Opportunity Act has meant significant increases in state support. How about this? Embracing the research. We know that when Black students have a teacher who looks like them in elementary school, just one teacher who looks like them in elementary school, the likelihood of that student graduating from high school is higher than those who do not. There are other compelling data, but for this reason and many others, the state has articulated a staff diversity goal of 25% teachers of color by 2030. We're currently at 9% and growing. And finally, there's another important fact that I hear about frequently in my new role, and that's the importance of giving districts engaging and meaningful equity work cover. It's no secret that in this context, even mentioning the word equity can draw out serious criticism. In the words of some, equity work is dangerous. How then does the state and its leadership give color, clearly indicate support, in fact, an expectation that this work is happening? This is a responsibility that I see as being squarely in my purview, and we'll be partnering with DEI leaders and districts across the state, as well as the Superintendent's Association and other groups to do just that. Now, earlier, I framed the work that we do as more than reading, writing, and arithmetic, and I really do mean that. It's about leveling the playing field and disrupting oppressive cycles. Seeing to it that everyone has the opportunity to have control over their own lives and the opportunity to participate meaningfully in the decisions that impact them as individuals and their families, the foundation of democracy. Now, not everybody sees the work of education as having those important ends. Nonetheless, a tie that binds all educators, regardless of their perspective and belief system, is that this work creates the conditions for young people to realize their dreams. Not some of them, not this kid or that kid, all of them. All of the children are all of ours. Whether the goal is to disrupt cycles, level the playing field, or create the conditions for realizing dreams, the work involves understanding, introspection, and equity. Now, this is hard work that's been going on for decades, and we know that sustainable change is a process, not an event. And now it's our turn to scribe our chapter in history, our contributions to forward progress for all students and for society. All of the children are all of ours. Thank you so much for having me here tonight.
Pat, you had one job. Messed up my screen. Thank you so much, Dr. Tutwiler, for opening up this second panel. And with that, we're going to head it over to Dr. Martin Garner, President of the Freedom to Read Foundation.
Thank you. I'm a member of the Freedom to Read Foundation, former president. Thank goodness I don't have that role at the moment. I am coming to you to talk about our work. We are here to support the freedom to read. We write legal briefs to support lawsuits that are challenging court cases and laws that are infringing on free expression. We are allied with the American Library Association. Has anyone in this room used a library before? Oh, okay. Good. All right. And so it's really our mission to make sure that when you walk into the library, you can see yourself reflected in the collection. Everybody should have the freedom to walk into a library and see their own experiences there on the shelf. You should be able to see programming that represents your interests, that validates who you are. And so in this time when we have seen a huge increase in book bans, I've been talking about this subject for decades, and now everyone's paying attention because they are coming for us. They are coming for all the books that they don't agree with, and we believe that everyone should have a right to read books that have accurate history so that you know what's going on in this country and what happened before and how we got into the situation that we're in now. And we believe that libraries are important to democracy because you have to be informed in order to make good choices when you vote. So I'm going to keep it brief, and I know we have more questions coming, so thank you for being here tonight, and I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
No.
I don't know. Oh, there we go. Now we're going to pass it to Faustina Cuevas, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion DEI Officer for the City of Lynn.
Hello. Okay. We're not in order, keeping you guessing, huh? You all awake? You're with us? Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Danica. Faustina Cuevas, she, ella pronouns. I work for the City of Lynn. I wear a few hats, but I wanted to briefly talk about the work that we're doing. As you all know, part of the conversations this evening really also have to do with government and how we've upheld institutional racism and the unraveling, undoing, unlearning centuries of that we have to do collectively, right? And it's not going to happen overnight. It takes time. I've done diversity, equity, inclusion work for the last 10 plus years of my life, and it's mostly been in institutions. And one of the reasons for that is to position myself to be within structures to do that undoing, unlearning, unraveling from within, and it takes time. But I wanted to mention that one thing that I'm really proud of is that the City of Lynn has been participating in a pilot program called the Racial Equity Municipal Action Plan, nicknamed REMAP for short. It's a pilot initiative by the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, funded by the Boston Federal Reserve Bank. And it was a pilot program that launched January 2020 after sort of the racial awakening that happened after the murder of George Floyd. There was funding available, and communities in Massachusetts could apply to be part of this pilot program to create a think tank of learning, municipalities coming together, educating themselves around how do you do racial equity work at the municipal level. At that time, Mayor Tom McGee applied for the pilot program. He brought a few folks together. Year one, actually, Adriana Paz was part of year one. And now year two, it's really focused more internally of what are municipalities actually able to do. And there's been a few sort of initiatives that have come out of that. We're able to reassess sort of our hiring practices. We're looking at our language access, strategies. One of our language access coordinator, Berta, is here, and they were offering interpreter services this evening. So there's a few initiatives that we're thinking about, things that we could be doing better. I got the signal that I have 1 minute. So those are just a few things that I wanted to throw out there, but I always come with this with humility and knowing that this takes time. These reflections are not easy, and I always come from it. I grew up in Lynn, I was raised here, and I want people to feel what I never felt walking into this building, which is being welcomed, feeling like you belong, like this is your building, that when you walk in, you're gonna see someone that looks like you, speaks your language, can direct you in your native language, that there's no barriers that make you feel like you have to turn around and leave. And I think we are getting better and better at that every day, and I feel really excited that we have a lot of more work to do, but that people are feeling that they can come in here and feel welcomed.
Thank you, Faustina. And I'd like to introduce next the Reverend Andre Bennett, President of Essex County Community Organization.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So the good Dr. Garner did not use all of his 3 minutes. I'll just take the remainder of his time, if that's all right.
I already got it.
Oh, no, you don't. I am the Reverend Dr. Andre Bennett. I serve as the pastor of youth and young adults at Zion Baptist Church here in Lynn, and I also serve as the president of the board of directors for the Essex County Community Organization, for short, ECHO. One of the things that's very important to me personally is when we talk about defending democracy, some of us have to know what democracy is if we're going to defend it. And what we found in our community is that the black and the brown members of our community aren't fully experiencing the democracy that we are trying to defend. And so ECHO, which is a member-based organization, it's a multi-faith, and that doesn't mean that you have to be a part of a faith group to be a member of ECHO. We reach something like close to 75,000 2,000 members across the Essex County, from Lynn up to Echo North, which is Gloucester, Annisquam, the Cape Ann area. What we've done is we've segmented Echo into different teams. So we have the Lynn Swampscott team, and one of the main focus of the Lynn Swampscott team is immigration justice. Because let's be honest, immigration injustice is a major issue within this country and even in the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, right? There are my brothers and my sisters from a lot of the Latino or the Latinx communities that cannot go to the police station and report if they feel threatened, because that's a threat for them just to go to the police station. Kids are in school and are being treated differently because of how they speak, because of how they sound, and primarily because of their immigration status or the immigration status of their parents. And then we have these Marblehead team, and the Marblehead team primarily focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion where police work is concerned. Now, Marblehead, there is a saying, I hope there's no Marblehead people here, but I also hope there are Marblehead people here. You will get arrested in Marblehead for driving while black. And let me just say that that is not just a joke. I have been pulled over a number of times. The Reverend Dr. Andre Bennett, who everybody by now knows is familiar with that name, have been pulled over a number of times in Marblehead just for driving through. I've been pulled over and asked by police officers if I'm lost. Let that sink in for a minute. And so, again, democracy should mean freedom for all of us, all right? If we're going to defend the democracy. Oh, 1 minute, sorry, I'm coming. And then when you think of the Echo North team focuses primarily on affordable housing. That's a big problem here, and especially in communities of colors. Again, we don't have, for the most part, generational wealth. We don't have parents and grandparents who've given us homes and stuff. So we have to work to build and to get. And so for the most part, sometimes we have to have a number of different family members living in the same structure. And there are a number of communities within the Essex County that cannot have multiple family dwellings because of how their laws are, because of how their housing laws are. So we are working to ensure that democracy is across the board. Our kids should not be pat down and should not be going through metal detectors if their white counterparts aren't doing that. Our young men should feel free to walk in their community. I'm coming. Our young men should feel free to walk in their community in a hooded shirt at 7 o'clock at night, and we don't have to worry about what is going to happen to them. Health care should be something that we can access. And so ECHO works across the board to ensure that democracy is not only defended, but that it is extended to all people. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Mr. Jeff Crosby, who has been involved in many different organizations, so I've abbreviated it to 3, but he's the past president of IUE CWA Local 201 and the North Shore Labor Council, and he's also the former executive director of the New Lynn Coalition, which is singular. Sorry, there's an error on the slide. But Jeff, without further ado.
So Westward Ho. I had a 8th grade teacher, Miss Fogg, who was legendary. She would jump on a chair and wave her arms and start yelling, "Westward Ho." And it was electrifying. People loved it. It was entertaining. Everybody talked about it. It's a long time later that I figured out this concept of manifest destiny, that white folks basically had the right to conquer the rest of the continent, neglected the fact that there was already people there. It didn't really occur to me until much, much later in my life. Much later than that, I figured out that my grandfather had an opportunity to prove a homestead homestead in North Dakota, and they were actually advertising for people as far as Europe to come and settle that land to sustain it against native people, protect the railroads, while folks were coming up from the South, African Americans, in the first wave of the Great Migration, and were not, needless to say, invited and sometimes excluded. That was a long time ago, but that 1964, that happened to me. But 30 years later, my son came home from Peabody High School, not Mississippi, and told me that the Civil War was not fought over slavery because most white folks didn't own slaves. This isn't, you know, Alabama. This is Peabody just a few years ago. So I won't, we understand how the Civil War was fought, and I'll just quote Carter Woodson, who was a brilliant black educator, one of the first PhDs, black PhDs from Harvard. He said, "When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do." So the fight to control our history in the schools and our own education, our own study is really critical. Because we don't have democracy, and I want to go to some tasks in a moment. Later, I think in questions, we'll talk about New Lynn. We don't have a democracy if a dozen people can sit around a boardroom in Connecticut and destroy thousands of jobs in the community in Lynn without even have to think twice about the impact on the people here. We don't have a democracy when 50 Democratic senators have the exact same vote and power to govern our country as 15 Republican senators, even though they represent 41 million more people. So Wyoming gets 2 votes. California, 65 times the population of Wyoming, gets 2 votes. That's minority rule, and that's really what we're dealing with. We don't have a democracy when a state like Wisconsin, where they have about a 50-50 split in the vote, in the popular vote, but the Republicans get 22 out of 33 state senators and 64 out of 99 state assembly people. That's minority rule. And Democrats, by the way, have done that too when they get the opportunity. And we don't have a democracy when the candidate who wins the popular vote for president loses the election. President Trump won in 2016, and he lost the vote by 2.9 million votes. And that's baked into the electoral system, which was set up, Electoral College, in part to defend the power of the slave states. So all that history is on our shoulders. It comes down with us, and we have a lot to do to expand, as Reverend Andre said, defend, expand, and transform democracy, just to get our feet on level territory so we can go from there. So this is still our country. For now, you know, whether it continues to be and we improve the lives of our many peoples that live in this country, you know, that remains to be seen.
Thank you, Jeff. And with that, I am pleased to introduce the first Black woman city councilor and the founder of the North Shore Juneteenth Association, Councilor Nicole McLean.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you to everyone who had anything to do with organizing this event. Representing the North Shore Juneteenth Association, which I am president and founder of, that organization is all about spreading awareness about the Juneteenth holiday, and it is also about educating the community regarding positive images and aspects of Black American history. In 2016, my son was walking home from school with a friend of his, and he was accosted by the police department. He was thrown to the floor. He had a knee in his back. He came home disheveled. He's never been, at this point, ever had any contact with the police department. So when he comes home and he has debris all over his shirt, he looks worried, he looks afraid. His friend has been arrested and taken to the police department. This incident made me feel more than ever that I had to do something to spread the awareness of Black American history in our country and in our community as a whole. It made me feel like even the police department, even the residents of Lynn need to understand who we are, where we're from, what we've done to contribute to this country as Black Americans. And the history is enormous, and we all benefit, all of us benefit, even immigrants benefit from what Black Americans have done in the civil rights movement, all of the movements that we've spearheaded, my ancestors have spearheaded. So to have my son thrown to the ground and treated in a way in which someone felt he deserved to be treated because he was a young black man walking down the street at night, and there was something going on over the radio about people being disruptive on the street. When we got to the police department to figure out what happened and why my son was treated in this way, why his friend was arrested, it ended up they were looking for a group of girls who were fighting in the street. They weren't even looking for boys, but because something was happening that night, my son was treated in this way. So North Shore Juneteenth Association came about first because I wanted to celebrate Black American culture in my community. I didn't see that happening a lot. And then this happened to my son, and I needed to do more than just celebrate. I needed to educate our community. So that's what North Shore Juneteenth Association is about. I invite you to look for us. We're at nsjuneteenth.com if you would like to do that. Another branch of me is I am the director of the Salvation Army's youth program right next door to here. So I work with children every single day, and I have been working with children throughout my career for a very long time, young children, so 0 to 5 years old. For right now, I'm working with 5 to 12 years old school-age children. So I'm very invested in our youth and making sure that we're representing for them. We're making sure that they are heard as well. And you know, defending democracy is about our children, right? We want them to be educated and to know where they've come from, what's ahead of them, and we have to support that. So I'm here today to just make sure we are doing that work. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor McLean. And last but most certainly not least, another individual that wears way too many hats to count, but some of those include being president of Prevent the Cycle and founder of North Shore Women of Color, Miss Adriana Paz.
Hello, hello. She said, my name is Adriana Paz, president of Prevent the Cycle and North Shore Women of Color. And I'm here because the question of whose voice is at the table when we're making decisions and prioritizing issues is a question that needs to be asked constantly. And we need to be aware of, we need to be observant, because often enough, when we talk about racial justice, when we talk about equity, the priorities aren't set by the very people who are affected, right? Or if we have them at the table, there's the limits, right? This is what we can do, this is what we want to do. So what Prevent the Cycle and through Prevent the Cycle, the coalition, the Lynn Racial Justice Coalition does is work on the priorities set by people of color, Black and brown men and women of Lynn, and we bring that to the table, we bring that to City Hall to work on. Since the creation, we've worked on body cameras, successfully implemented that where it's required when the police officers go on calls. Use of force was updated, and now we're working on the unarmed response team. And this team will respond to nonviolent calls that are usually going to the police, that require mental health professionals, that require weaponized individuals going to these calls. So we're talking about homeless, we're talking about those who are loitering, we have, again, mental health crisis. All these types of calls are being addressed by one group who are expected to do it all and do it well, and what our team is saying is they're not. We don't feel the safety, we don't feel the community care, and so we are presenting our solution, what we believe will be what provides us with the care and the safety that we want, and this is what we're going to implement. And that's what we're doing. We're pushing to make sure that we are listened to, and whatever policies come to play, they are exactly what our community wants without barriers and limitations.
Thank you. And with that, we are going to transition to our Q&A. You can submit questions. Again, a reminder on the index cards and pencils provided. We do have a couple of questions that we prepared, one of which is that many of you may or may not know that this week is Banned Book Week. So I'm sure, Martin, you're very busy right about now. With that, there has been an unprecedented spike, even in Massachusetts, in book challenges across public schools and libraries. Given that the vast majority of Americans oppose book banning, how do we balance free speech and expression against parental rights?
That's a great question. When you have the freedom to read, you have the freedom to choose what you want to read. It means if there's something that you see on the shelf that you don't want to read, you are free to not pick it up. You also, as a parent, you have the absolute right to direct your child's reading. We support that as librarians, but you do not have the right to decide what other children get to read. Every parent of a trans child has the right to see that their child's life is represented in the collection. Every Black parent has the right to know that their children will not be given books that only talk about the skills you can learn while being enslaved. So parents do have rights, but they end at their family. And it's important to make sure that the collections, the programming, the resources that are available reflect the interests of the community, and that everyone, again, has the right to see themselves on the shelves.
So this is for everyone, I suppose. What role do you see for voting, largely increasing participation?
What do you see for voting, increasing participation?
What role do you see for voting, and that's in regards to increasing participation in our local elections?
Anybody can go?
Anybody.
Okay, so for increasing voter turnout and making sure people are informed, while it's not just the city's job, I do think as a city we can do better with informing our community when there is an election cycle happening. The lighted signs that are out could say, vote November 7th. We could do robocalling. I know I've talked to people in the clerk's office. They said that there's not funding for that type of thing, but we could always search for it and try to make sure we're doing robocalls to our residents and informing them that it's a voting cycle. There's a lot of things we can do to raise awareness, and emailing. There's a email list that the city has, so we could utilize that. There's a lot of things that we aren't utilizing that I feel could be implemented, and we could mobilize those types of avenues in order to increase our voter participation. I think one of the things that we have to understand is that people are living it. They know that something's not working for them, right? That the city or state, there's a disconnect, and they are struggling. So it's not only informing them, it's motivating them. When we have people in office who get that story and will truly advocate for that, advocate for their specific needs, and reach out to them, that is the motivation people will need. They need to know that you know their stories, more than know that you've lived their experiences. And that would also draw people. There's apathy, right? There's a lot of people like, why am I going to vote? It's going to be the same. And so part of what we have to do is make sure that our elected officials represent these communities, have lived those experiences, and are going to truly advocate for them on the level of that personal experience.
I also think that sometimes you get to voting indirectly by showing people what they can do themselves in organizing, and sometimes that can lead to more voter participation. And so the New Lynn Coalition, there's a bunch of things. We got a food aid program that supports about 700 families in the city. That's about 3% of the population. We help build affordable housing with the Lynn Housing Authority, the Gateway Project that's mostly affordable. Help got a diverse hiring committee that works with the schools to try to increase the diverse folks in the staff amongst teachers and paras. And we have an enrichment program, LCEP, that we work with the public schools on to open up classes at night for adults. And that's all the way from carpentry to cake decoration. And the point is you get people involved in doing things and showing them what regular working class folks can do and impact their community step by step, like a lot of the things that you've heard about tonight. And then you express that at the polls as well. And we do believe in voting. We don't endorse candidates. I do want to make a plug on the 19th. I think Tish Mukala, our president, is out there somewhere with some flyers. On October 19th, we're going to be having a forum for counselors at large at the Lynn Museum. And I hope people will come down and see it. And what I always ask when they're voting, that's one reason I'm voting for Nicole, is what did they do before they ran for office? What did they do in the community to show what they could actually change and care, and then they ran? What did they do before they decided to run for office? So I hope we'll see you all on the 19th.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. What does it say about Lynn's so-called dedication to equity, diversity, and inclusion when only one person of color, our Superintendent Alvarez, holds a position of power and influence in Lynn's department and agency leadership positions? We have a very diverse population in Lynn, but a dismal lack of diverse faces and opinions in positions where the power in this city is wielded.
Yeah, I can. Danica, you're going to have to repeat that. I heard part of it. I just want to, can you just repeat that again?
So if it's okay to summarize.
Yes, summarize.
What does it say about Lynn's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion when only one person of color, Dr. Alvarez, the current superintendent of schools, is in what seems to be the only position of power and influence in the city? Yeah. When the city is so diverse, why is that not represented in other leadership positions in the city?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take that, and if anybody wants to chime in, but obviously I work for the city, so I'll take that one. I will say that we are making great strides to try to just address racial representation across the board. In the last year, 2/3 of our hires have been people of color in our building, and I do want to give a shout out to our personnel director, Drew Russo, who's here tonight, who has been really committed. He's been part of our remap process. We've been talking a lot about racial equity, racial representation through our remap process, and we really have made an effort to make sure that we're posting everywhere, posting our posts where you wouldn't traditionally post them, on LinkedIn, on social media, translating it. You know, one time somebody asked me, like, well, if this role is gonna require English language skills, why are you translating it? I'm like, because there might be a parent that might say, hey, daughter, son, whoever, you might be great for this. I saw this post on social media, on Facebook. So it's also just about really having people, anyone that could read a job post. I also want to say that there's more work that we're doing around that leadership, that representation. We just hired Jessica Shapini, who's going to be our new parking director. Jessica is a Black woman. I think she has been, she's been working in city government for a little bit now. She's very excited. So I think that there's a lot of work that we are doing, and maybe it's not being seen. Maybe we're not talking about it as much as we should be. But there's still a lot of work to be done. To that person's point, it's going to take time. And to my comments earlier, right, there's a lot that we have to do. There's a lot of work that has been a foundation that we are sitting on, that we now have to sort of peel back the layers, and that's going to take time. But I think we're making strides, and not to toot my own horn, but I think I'm also a leader, and I'm a woman of color, and a Latina, bilingual, grew up here, and parent, daughter of immigrants. So I think we are making those steps. And Dr. Alvarez is also building a really amazing team, of assistants, and who also represent the community, speak the language. So,
thank you. I might throw this one at you, Dr. Tutwiler. Oh, I apologize.
I just have one quick comment, question is, how much power do they have in those positions is more important to me than having more people in positions of power. If you have no power, if you're given that seat of leadership, but you are controlled, you're told your limits, that's not real power. So I would rather want to have that question asked before we put people in power.
Thank you. Sorry to miss that. Dr. T, thoughts about doing away with AP courses because some kids can't keep up and experience discrimination?
So I'm going to respectfully disagree with the premise that kids can't keep up or be successful in those classes. You cannot or should not be an educator if you don't believe that every student is capable of achieving at a high level, so long as they're given the right supports, right? Every student is capable of doing that. And so my quick answer to that is I would not be in favor of doing away with advanced placement courses. I will say, conversely, that I'm a bigger fan of early college courses, which are deeply rooted in equity, and what we've seen across the state for communities like Lynn that are engaging in early college programs is that those students graduate at higher rates, they matriculate to college at higher rates, and I think most importantly, they persist in college at higher rates. And so I don't know that I can say that necessarily about AP, but I'm not at all opposed to it, and I believe that every student's capable of being successful in it.
This one, I think, is for the broader panel. How can a progressive mayor and council educate a police department that needs sensitivity training?
What was the question? What was the question?
How can a progressive mayor and council educate a police department that needs sensitivity training?
Progressive mayor and council.
Well, one thing, if you have to be trained in sensitivity, I think that's something we have to talk about. But one of the things I will say is, in whatever field you're in, especially if you're serving the community, if you are not from that community and understand their journey, that right there is going to be the biggest mistake. That we need that across the board. However, studies show sensitivity training, bias training, especially in police departments, work temporarily, but is not a permanent solution. So we need to go beyond the trainings and figure out the culture, because that is what's leading to a lot of the concerns and questions and the feeling of that it's not for Black and brown communities.
I'm going to echo Adriano on the culture because I'm big on that. I feel like we really need to look into what our new police officers are being indoctrinated into when they go into the police department. If we could ever get that close of a look into how our police department is, nurturing officers once they come in, and what's seen as acceptable, what's seen as a offense that needs to be a reported offense. We need to know more about how deep all of this really is, because it's not about even the culture of as far as the color of our police officers. It's more about their mental and their hearts and minds more than anything else. It's not about the color of their skin. It's about what they believe and what they've accepted as the rule of being a police officer. So I think really speaking to them more, speaking to our police officers, getting an idea of where they're coming from, what their beliefs are, and why they believe what they believe. I think we really just need to speak with the police department more, and and even have them talk to, like, have a panel like this for police officers. Have the community talk to them and have a Q&A. You know what I mean? What was your journey like? So we can understand each other more, community and police. I believe that's what we need to do.
I think hiring practice is a huge piece of it. We have to look at the culture and the hiring practice of the police department. I've been with ECHO going on 14 years before I became the president 4 years ago. And I remember sitting, it was a group of us, clergy, 5 of us, sitting in the chief's office, the previous chief of, a few chiefs ago, police officer's office in the city of Lynn, proposing the idea of implicit bias training. And this police chief pounded his fist on his desk and told us that it will never happen because they already get implicit bias training. And when finally we pressed and about a year and a half, ECHO was able to have an implicit bias training. Police officers came in and sat in the back, most of them on their phones during the entire time. So if police officers do not believe that there's a need for sensitivity training, if they do not believe there's a need for implicit bias training, we could train until we can't train no more. We have to look at hiring practices, who we're bringing into the police forces, what their motives are, what connections they have to our community, their understanding of the lived experiences of members of our communities, and their willingness to learn and to grow with the communities that they serve.
This isn't a direct answer, but I think it's important to remember what Adriana talked about before and others on this panel have worked for, of an unarmed crisis response team. One answer is let the police do what the police are supposed to do, and let's figure out how to make them do it better. But they don't need to send men with guns to every time that someone has a mental health issue, a noise complaint, a homeless person is sleeping on the street, or littering or whatever else. And we could take a lot of that away. The police feel that they're understaffed. Let them narrow down fighting crime, and let's get all that other stuff, which we've seen time and again can escalate. Let's get that off the table and let professionals who have been through PTSD as veterans maybe, or who have mental health training, let them deal with that stuff and let the police deal with police issues. That would be a start.
All right. I think I'll make this the last question, only because I don't want to keep folks overnight, although I'm sure we could find some pillows and blankets if need be. The best defense is a good offense. How do we go on offense on the following issues? Expanding libraries and access to books, overcoming minority rule, in parentheses, U.S. Senate Electoral College, and expanding history teaching in high school and higher ed.
Expanding minority rule. Expanding libraries and books, and something else.
I know. Let me break it down for you. So the best defense is a good offense. So of these issues, expanding libraries and access to books, overcoming minority rule, and expanding history teaching, what is an offensive approach that we can take to advance those issues?
Break rules. Break rules. Do it. We live in a country, listen, we have a man running for president right now that is a habitual criminal. Habitual criminal. We have individuals in my church house that cannot get a job at Dunkin' Donuts because 15 years ago they were caught with pot. but we have a criminal running for the White House. We need to get to a point where enough has become too much. Not enough is enough. Enough is too much. People are having issues with books and libraries. Build more libraries and buy more books and put more books in libraries. People are having issues with schools. Show up at schools. We have got to get to a point where we begin to break some of these archaic rules who, one, did not include people who look and sound like me to begin with, and two, exclude a great fraction of our community. We have to get to a point where enough has become too much. And for me, that's the offense. That is, you know, one of the things that we do at ECHO is public actions. When we had the poster child of governor here in Massachusetts living across the street over in Swampscott, we showed up. He knows me he knows my face, because we show up all the time. We get people. I don't believe in violence, but certainly the power of the people is greater than the people in power, and it's about time we understand where our power is and show up in our power.
We should just end there.
No,
that was good.
I mean, I feel like that was it,
Yeah,
right?
we don't have anything to add to
Everybody
that.
got it,
What
right?
he
Everybody
said.
understood? Okay. And may I mention again that he preaches on Sundays at Zion Baptist Church. If folks are interested, all are welcome. Big round of applause to all of our panelists. Thank you. And then I would also like to thank again our reenactors, and then of course Dr. Kabria Baumartner and Mayor Billy. Our reenactors are Michael Crutcher and Steve Wood. Come on out, everybody. And thank you all so much. I know that we ran over, but I appreciate you all staying, enjoying the conversation, participating. I'm sure all of you know how important programs like these are. I also want to thank again my co-conspirators, Steve Matthews and Wendy Joseph, who's been hiding behind the scenes. Come on out, Wendy. Good work. Oh, thank you. This has been a year-long process, and to finally have all of this hard work culminate in this spectacular evening, I personally can't thank you all enough, but it goes to show that programs like these are important and they need to happen more often. So we hope that this is the first of many. Steve personally has a wish for this program to go on tour, but I also want to give a special shout out, yes, Tom, you're hiding, Mr. Tom Dalton, who came in and helped us promote this event and really leveraged his connections in making this program possible. We were featured in the Boston Globe, and that would not have been possible without Tom Dalton. So again, thank you all. Thank you to everybody who contributed to the program. Thank you to our panelists, and get home safe.